I like the small ones there. It's funny. I just discovered. I like those small ones too, and it's funny. I just discovered them like 2 weeks ago.
Discovered what?
That there was a Victor Bennis in the back there.
Hang on, let me get my variegates. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I can hear you.
Your faces to see today. Bruce is with us. Hi, Merle. Missed you on Tuesday.
Merle never misses anything.
I was saying that I never knew there was a Victor Bennis in the back there.
Oh, it's fabulous.
Until like 2 weeks ago. I had no idea.
There used to be one in Century City at the at the grocery store. I can't think of the name of the grocery store, but it's not there.
Yeah. No, I think it is now.
That's what we need here is a Bennis bakery. You can send it to me.
Doesn't everyone?
If I ever get to leave Phoenix, further than Prescott or Sedona.
Absolutely right.
They don't have a Jewish bakery in Phoenix?
We have Chompies, but they don't. It's not the same. It's mostly bagels, but they don't have the same quality as Bennis.
Okay.
Well, I've got one better for you, and this is also a means of welcoming folks who are watching us live on Facebook. In addition, probably my mother who's watching us live on Facebook. That my parents live in Santa Barbara. Forget the Victor Bennis. There is not a deli in Santa Barbara. You cannot get.
No, but
you cannot get a corned beef sandwich if your life depended on it.
I didn't realize that.
Do they have a Victor Bennis at Gelson's?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure. You're right. There is a Gelson's.
They used to in Century City, but I don't think they do anymore.
I think they still do in Century City.
Oh yeah, they do. Well, yes, they do.
You know,
for a while it wasn't there. So
clearly, 24 Jews on Zoom talking about deli and baked goods could go
food.
It's food.
But I don't think that's quite what we all tuned in for today. So I'm gonna move us
sure, why not?
I'm gonna move us a little bit onto hopefully our topic du jour. And I'll start with, I don't think I did this last time, but I usually do when I teach, by saying that, and this is just sort of my own personal style when teaching, is that I don't think there's a such thing as an interruption. Or I also don't think there's such thing as something that's really off topic, which I think in many ways is sort of a Talmudic style of teaching, because for those who don't know, the way the Talmud is organized is, usually asking a question about some particular phrase or verse or teaching. And then the game that the rabbis play is to see how far afield they can get from whatever the question was, how seemingly unrelated and off topic they can get, and yet still at the end bring it back to the initial question. So it's a long way of saying, if I say something that sparks a question or a thought or an idea, type it in the chat, raise a virtual hand or a hand in real life, and as soon as I see it, I'll get to it and we'll explore it together. While today is Shabbat Torah study, and we're going to get to the Torah portion for this week, which is Ki Tetzei, we're going to begin talking a little bit about the Hebrew month of Elul that began just last week. We're in the second Shabbat of the month of Elul. Elul began last Friday. Because one, I think it's important, and two, because I think it actually lays the foundation for what I'd like to talk about pertaining to this week's parsha. So we're in this month of Elul, which is the month in the Hebrew calendar that immediately precedes the High Holy Days, immediately precedes Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And there are many interesting sort of teachings about the month of Elul. We're going to talk about some of them now, but one that I think is particularly interesting is this idea that Elul is actually an acronym. Some rabbis say that the Hebrew letters Aleph, Lamed, Vav, Lamed, that spell Elul, are an acronym for the phrase Ani ledodi vedodi li. Ani ledodi vedodi li. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine, which is a pretty well-known phrase from the Song of Songs that is frequently inscribed on some Jewish wedding bands, is frequently recited as a part of vows at a Jewish wedding, right? This idea that, hearkening to the Song of Songs, this romance, this love affair between two people. But in the context of Elul, the rabbis often teach that it is about the love relationship between God and the Jewish people, right? That God is our beloved and we are God's beloved. And that, I think, actually sets the stage for this entire season in a little bit of a different way than I think we sometimes think of it. I think sometimes we think of the high holy days of Yom Kippur, of Elul, of this, examining our flaws and trying to be better, and this metaphorical idea that God is going to be in judgment as just that, as judgment, as, begging for forgiveness. When if we approach it as something in the context of this beloved, loving relationship, right, then it's not God trying to be punitive and punishing us for, our shortcomings. Mm-hmm. It's God loving us and helping us and wanting us to be better and wanting us to achieve our full potential as a human being in the coming year. So that's sort of the motif I think that we're meant to really approach this entire season, and particularly the month of Elul with, is in this context of this loving relationship between God and the Jewish people. Now, there are a couple of customs. There's really 5 major customs that usually take place during the month of Elul that remind us of the liturgy that this season is meant to prepare us for the high holy days. So the one that most people probably are relatively familiar with is blowing the shofar, right? We all know that we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. In fact, there's only one commandment, just as a side note, only one commandment associated with Rosh Hashanah, and it has to do with the shofar. And if anybody remembers the sermon I gave a couple years ago, it has nothing to do with blowing the shofar, actually. It has to do with listening to the shofar. The only commandment associated with Rosh Hashanah is to listen to the sound of the shofar, because the shofar is meant to shake us, to wake us out of our complacency and force us to examine our lives and examine ourselves so that we can, be better in the year to come, which is exactly why we blow the shofar during the month of Elul. So traditionally, during the month of Elul, the shofar is blown each and every morning, with the exception of Shabbat. More on that in a second, if that raised a red flag for anybody. For that exact reason, right? To sort of wake us up and say, hey, Rosh Hashanah is coming. Yom Kippur is coming. Get ready. Start doing the work now, which is also, I think, in large part the purpose of Elul. I think so many of us show up on Rosh Hashanah and expect to start the work then and think, well, we have 10 days till Yom Kippur at best. Or even worse, show up on Yom Kippur and expect to do it all that day. It doesn't work that way, right? That's like, showing up to the match having never practiced. The entire month of Elul is meant to be this month of beginning the work and the preparation, so that when we show up, we're ready to do it. So if it raised a red flag for anyone when I said that the shofar is blown every morning with the exception of Shabbat, perhaps it's because if you this year tuning in on Zoom, but in a typical year, if you show up on a Friday night or Shabbat morning during the month of Elul at the temple, at the very end of the service, you'll hear us blow shofar, which you're not supposed to do. And from our perspective and that of many non-Orthodox anyway congregations, the rationale is we're not all together every morning at a minyan to blow shofar during the month of Elul, and we are on Shabbat, and that's an opportunity to hear the shofar through the month of Elul. And the prohibition against blowing the shofar on Shabbat has nothing to do with blowing the shofar on Shabbat. It has to do with the idea that you would have to carry the shofar to the synagogue in order to blow it on Shabbat, right? And the prohibition is actually the carrying of the shofar. And since, there's one in my office, I just have to carry it downstairs. So, but that's our thinking, is that that's when we're together during the month of Elul. But every year, again, not so much on Zoom, but every year there's some service and someone comes up to me and says, why didn't you blow shofar? It's Shabbat. So that's, if anybody was wondering, kind of our thinking. So that's the first of these 5 sort of liturgical practices that we get into. The next one is a collection of prayers called slichot. Now, we use slichot frequently to refer to a special service conducted in the Ashkenazi community, usually about a week and a half before Rosh Hashanah. It's on the Saturday night preceding Rosh Hashanah, but there has to be a Shabbat in between, so it's at least a week before Rosh Hashanah. Usually very late in the evening, close to midnight. We're going to have, here's a quick plug, we're going to have a lovely community slichot service, as we have the last few years, on Zoom this year, with, again, learning and teaching opportunities from a bunch of us, rabbis and cantors from a number of different congregations, and then we'll come together for a service. And that service includes these sort of special petitionary prayers. And the prayers themselves are called slichot, and that's why the service gets that name. But traditionally, these penitential prayers of slichot, of sort of pouring our hearts out and again doing this preparation and work for this season and these holidays, happens every day. And if those slichot prayers are added to the traditional service every day throughout this month of Elul. This is one that maybe people aren't quite as familiar with, which is that it's customary, in addition to at other times of the year, to visit the graves of loved ones during this month of Elul. Also to do it, by the way, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur also is a common thing, although that's not Elul. And, I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one is that it just reminds us of those folks on whose shoulders we stand. I think it helps us to honor their memories. But I think it also helps us to think about our own lives and, frankly, to think about our own mortality, which, as many of us know, is actually the point of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is actually, in some ways, depending on how you feel about these things, far more morbid than many of us would think. The reason at the beginning of the service that the ark is open and the Torahs are not in it, an empty ark, is that it is meant to be as if we were staring into our casket. And in Hebrew, actually, the word for casket is aron, and the word for ark is aron, right? We wear white because we're wearing the burial shroud. And in fact, in a traditional community, men wear something called a kittel, which looks sort of like a cross between a lab coat and a bathrobe. We had a rabbi, maybe my mother's watching on Facebook, I'll sort of just talk about her. We got a new rabbi when I was growing up. I think I was in high school. And he was sort of a more traditional bent than our prior rabbi, who wore, choir type judicial robes, white robes, the way we all do. And so this new rabbi wore a traditional kittel. And he wore like a regular white robe on Rosh Hashanah. But on Yom Kippur, he walked out of the bima wearing this kittel. And my mother turned to me and said, "What is that? His bathrobe?" Right? And that's sort of, but traditionally a man wears a kittel on 3 occasions. Under the chuppah at his wedding, every year on Yom Kippur, and he's buried in it. And the reason you wear it on Yom Kippur is that Yom Kippur is actually meant to be a rehearsal for one's death. And that's part of the reason you don't eat. Not the only reason, but part of the reason you don't eat. And as morbid as all that may sound, the idea in this metaphorical sense, and again, with the metaphor of the book of life and the gates are closing and all of this, is to imagine, to behave, to approach it as if
got mail.
We weren't going home, as if that was, this day was it. And to really face our own mortality. Because I think that hopefully facing one's mortality has, facing the reality of one's death has the ability to help us decide how we want to live. And I think that's also part of the reason that we visit, the graves of loved ones during this month of Elul is for a similar reason. I think that, realizing our own mortality and thinking about what kind of legacy do we want to leave? Are we currently, Rabbi Leader many years ago wrote a piece talking about, I think it was called The Pen of Our Lives. And it was this idea that, the rabbi doesn't write your obituary at your funeral. You write it. You write it with the life that you live. And, to sort of think about our lives and say, am I living the life right now that I want my eulogy to be, the life that I want those who come after me to hear about? And if not, because I think if we're all being honest, there are aspects that we're probably not. What am I going to do in this new year to live that life? And I think that comes from in many ways from facing our own mortality. All right, enough about that morbidity. We also, it's customary to recite Psalm 27 during the month of Elul, again, because it kind of speaks to these themes. Interestingly, the first half of the 27th Psalm talks about sort of God's undying sort of acceptance and forgiveness, and that no matter what has happened, God will forgive us and such. And then the second half again sort of deals with some of these issues of morbidity and mortality. And then last but not least, throughout this month and throughout all these things we've been talking about, is this idea of, the Hebrew is heshbon hanefesh, which literally means like an accounting or a check of one's soul, right? For those who know modern Hebrew, heshbon is the word for like check in a restaurant, if you want the check, right? But it is this process of reflection and introspection in which we're meant to study and take time for deep, meaningful personal reflection, to really look at all of our actions of the past year, and then to seek forgiveness from the other people in our lives that we've wronged, to really look at the ways that we've, to use the metaphor we all know pretty well, missed the mark in our interactions and our behaviors with folks, and really, really try to make it right. And just, I'll underscore what I think we all probably know and have heard a million times. But it is unique to Judaism, I think, right? Which is this idea that for the vast majority of the shortcomings, sins, transgressions, whatever you want to call them, that, many of us, are guilty of, to use a big word, God is not who we need forgiveness from. It's the other human being that we've wronged, right? And that's, we all probably know that phrase from the prayer book, which comes from the Mishnah, pretty well, right? That for transgressions between, human beings and God, Yom Kippur atones. But for transgressions between one human being and another, Yom Kippur does not atone until they have made peace with one another, right? So it's not, this is not, just to oversimplify, this is not Catholicism. This is not, 3 Hail Marys and an Our Father or whatever for, you embezzled money from the boss. You embezzled money from the boss, you got to make it right with the boss. Then you can seek God for forgiveness. If you feel bad because, you ate a BLT for lunch, you can take that up with God. But if you did something to wrong another human being, that's between you and that human being, and you got to, make that right. That's who you need forgiveness from. That's who you need to reach out to, and that's something that can happen during this month of Elul. Yeah, Miriam, I see your hand up.
Yes, what you're saying is so interesting. I don't mean to interrupt it, but you did say something that stuck with me a little, so I need to ask this question.
Please.
You said when you open the Aron on Yom Kippur, the Aron is empty of Torahs. I never knew that. In other words, you're opening the Aron and you're seeing no Torah in it.
Well,
where is the Torah scroll?
I'll say it this way. I slightly misspoke. So here's a quick trivia question. What is, for all intents and purposes, the very first thing that happens in the evening service on Kol Nidre? Gary.
You march
after the rabbi tells you to turn your cell phone off.
You march the Torahs down the aisles and bring them to the ark.
Close. That's Rosh Hashanah, actually, at least in culture. The very first thing is Kol Nidre, is the cantor chanting Kol Nidre, right? And what happens at Kol Nidre? Just to think about the imagery for a second. We take the Torahs out of the ark. We have 3, so we take all of them out. And you have 3 people holding 3 Torahs, standing with the cantor as he chants Kol Nidre. The ark is empty. So that's the empty ark moment, is during the chanting of Kol Nidre. And the whole idea of Kol Nidre is that is this, that is like the Beit Din Shel Mala is the idea, the heavenly court, right? And it's supposed to have 3 judges, and those are the 3 Torahs. That's the idea and the motif of Kol Nidre is that we are sitting in, before the heavenly court, accounting for our deeds before this empty ark. So it's not empty for the whole service, and you're correct. It's actually not empty when the service first begins. It's empty near the beginning when the ark. I saw Sukasa and then Susan.
Yeah, I was just curious why, but you kind of answered it, that it represents 3 judges, the baked in.
Why the 3, or why is it? So it's empty. It is empty for this idea of the imagery. I think of a casket. Why 3? Yeah. So it's at least 3 people. You don't have to have 3 Torahs, but you usually have at least 3 people sort of standing there symbolizing this heavenly court. So it could be the rabbi, the cantor, and the temple president that's sitting up there, or whoever. It just works well because our ark is set up for 3 Torahs, and that works well. Yeah, Susan.
I'm glad that Miriam asked that, because I was wondering about that too. And then the number 3, I thought it was just because we have 3 Torahs, but you're saying. And then,
the reason we hold 3 is because we have 3. Here's how much we finagle this. To go back to Gary's comment,
okay.
On Rosh Hashanah, which has nothing to do with Rosh Hashanah, it's just, I think it's just minchag, that we have, which is the custom that we have at the temple. And frankly, I think makes a good theater, which is we carry on Rosh Hashanah. Actually, we do begin with no Torahs in the ark, but the ark is closed, so you wouldn't know that, right? And we process at the very beginning of the service, right, Torahs into the sanctuary, and it's kind of this lovely, kind of moment, right? And if you've ever noticed, we bring in 4 Torahs.
Oh, somebody has to mute.
Yeah. There we go. We bring in 4 Torahs, even though only 3 fit in the ark, to your point, Susan. Why? Because we have 4 aisles in the sanctuary, and it works better now. So there is an aspect of theater to all of it, just to kind of call a spade a spade. Yeah, go ahead, Susan. You're muted still.
You said it means the ark, but it also means something else.
Oh, I said the word aron literally means ark, but it's also the word in Hebrew for a casket. Is an aron.
For
a casket.
Tactic.
No, a casket, a coffin.
Oh, cactus.
Casket.
Oh, captain. That's what I didn't get. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so this week, we're going to move on to the Torah portion now, but keeping all of this Elul context in mind. So the Torah portion that we read this week, our second Shabbat into the month of Elul, is Ki Tetzei. And yeah, Jeff.
Just one question as to the picture that you drew with the Torah standing there in the face of the greatest disavowal of vowels, which is the prayer that is said there. It just seems like a strange juxtaposition where you have Kol Nidre, the disavowal of all vows, in front of the Torah, which is the seat of the vows and mitzvah, which we must keep. It just seems strange to me as a picture.
I can understand that. A few thoughts come to mind, I suppose, of which many may disagree, which is, Judaism. I think it's, I think understanding Kol Nidre, here's the first thing. I think understanding Kol Nidre as some, out clause for any commitment one makes is I guess is shortchanging Kol Nidre and is a little simplistic, because I don't think that's it. That is certainly the way it has been for many centuries, interpreted by Jewish critics. Right? You can't trust the Jews because of this hocus pocus prayer they have. They say once a year, and every business deal and every handshake means nothing, right? Which just incidentally is why for the better part of at least a century, the early to mid to late 19th century into early 20th century in German and American Reform prayer books, And I don't know, I don't hear it at home. I don't have it, but the prayer book, for example, the prayer book that was used at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, the Union Prayer Book, up until, the late 80s, up until shortly after Harvey Fields came, up until we started using the prayer book we use now. And some, like Susan, you probably remember that old UPB prayer book before Harvey's. The text of Kol Nidre was not in the book. The words were not in the book. You got to that point in the service, and it just says in bold capitals, the choir or the cantor sing Kol Nidre. And the reason it wasn't printed in the book was exactly because of this reason was, well, we don't want somebody else to look at this and say that, this is what this means that we don't, right? So, for me, Kol Nidre is much more about, and the way it to me is complementary to your point, Jeff, about the Torah being a book of rules, which is very apropos to the Torah portion this week, is to say, yeah, these are the rules. And if you try, if you commit to doing, and you do your best and you fall short, you can have a fresh start. I mean, to me, Kol Nidre is all about a fresh start and a second chance, right? And I think that's, look at the Torah, right? The people, God is all about second chances in the Torah, right? From, Moses, from Noah and the flood, from, the people, and the biggest one is the Israelites and the golden calf, right? And God's ready to be done with them. And Moses convinces God to forgive them and give the people a second chance. So, the Torah paints pictures of deeply flawed people who make all sorts of mistakes and who are given the opportunity to not forever be punished for those mistakes. And I think that, is I think in a slightly more nuanced way what Kol Nidre is really about. And to your point about the Torah being this kind of, work of, well, this is what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to behave. I couldn't think of a better segue. Thank you for taking that up for me for this week's Torah portion, Ki Tetzei, which, so many of us know, 613 commandments in the Torah, 74 of those 613 commandments. So that's like what, 15, 16%, something like that, 17%, almost 20%. Not almost 20%. Of those commandments are in this week's parsha. 74 commandments. There's a litany of them, and they're wide-ranging in what they deal with, right? So first, Moses reviews this long list of laws that go for everything from family to animals to property, and then we get into civil and criminal laws that are delineated, those that have to do with sexual relationships, those relationships with husbands and wives and children, the way we're meant to react with others, with non-Israelites, how loans are meant to be treated, how debts are meant to be treated, when we make vows and commitments, what's supposed to happen if someone wants to get divorced. There's laws of commerce, fair wages, proper weights and measures, having honest weights and measures, not double standards. And then the very end of the Torah portion concludes with this this instruction, or this command that some of us may be familiar with, which is to always remember Amalek. Right? Amalek, this sort of villain that gets called about many times throughout Jewish history. But to remember Amalek and this horrible, heinous, atrocious thing that Amalek did, coming after the Israelites as they were fleeing from Egypt on the road out of Egypt, and killing the old and the weak and the infirmed, and to never forget that sort of heinous act. So there's lots and lots of laws in this parasha, and some of them are more interesting than others. But I thought as a means of introduction, kind of give you my top 10. It's actually 11, but we're going to call it top 10. So first is a prohibition against, in today's world, we might call it cross-dressing, right? That a man is not supposed to wear women's clothing and a woman is not supposed to wear man's clothing. More on that in a minute. There's a prohibition against planting a vineyard with different kinds of, seeds, right? So you shouldn't plant strawberries with blueberries, or you shouldn't plant corn with, wheat or what have you. A prohibition against plowing a field with an ox and a donkey at the same time. A prohibition, some people might know, it's called shatnez, wearing garments that are a mixture of wool and linen, which if you think is ridiculous, in more traditional communities, if you walk into like a Orthodox yeshiva, I kid you not, there'll be bulletin boards, and you might see a note on the bulletin board that says, Moshe's tailor shop on 5th Street has been discovered to be selling suits that say they're 100% wool, but actually contain linen. Don't shop there anymore. So it's a legit thing that people follow. So those 4, right, are all, I think, reflect, one, a discomfort with mixing things, a discomfort with things that that don't fit neatly into categories, which is absolutely something that plagues the rabbis. Call it early Jewish OCD, call it whatever you want, but the rabbis are very uncomfortable with things, with people, with circumstances and situations that don't fit neatly into boxes and categories. And I think a lot of what's baked into those particular instructions is this idea of we want things nice and neat and separate. That being said, right, ask any farmer, you plant 2 crops next to each other and they're not the right 2 crops next to each other, that doesn't go well, right? So there's also, I think, some, maybe wisdom, some of this might be practical. On a more kind of, spiritual level, perhaps, there's a prohibition against, it says if a mother bird is sitting on her nest, on her eggs, you cannot, and you want to go get an egg, you can't take the mom with the eggs, right? If you want an omelet, you can't take the mom with the eggs. You have to set the mom free, but you can take the eggs, right? This kind of idea, I think of, there's a similar to kashrut, I think, an attempt at some sort of humanity in that. There's a prohibition against returning a slave who's come to take refuge with you, right? So if someone, flees from slavery and you take them in, and whoever their slave driver master is comes searching for them, you're not allowed to turn them over. Similar to the, Sukasa.
How does that square with the fact that people own slaves? In other words, aren't you, this is not, if you were allowed to own slaves, then aren't you keeping somebody's property?
That's a very interesting question, particularly with where we're going to go today about returning property. It's a very interesting question. I don't really know.
So don't you commit another sin by keeping something that doesn't belong to you?
I think there's this very interesting duality in the Torah, which is that, yes, slavery is clearly present in the Torah.
Yeah.
And yet, slaves never seem to be referred to as property. When properties discussed, slaves are never mentioned.
Okay.
And you have these things like this particular commandment, right? That if presumably someone else's slave, right, takes refuge with you, that you can't return them because they're a human being. In the same way, if you think about sort of the whole thing about cities of refuge and criminals who can seek refuge in a city of refuge, right? That they may be a criminal, who knows what, it may be a heinous act, but that they're a human being and as a result entitled to certain, human protections. So I think it's a conflict. I think there's this conflict in Torah between slavery, but yet, also trying to recognize humanity.
It's an overstatement, though, when you look at it. There is no slavery in the Jewish culture in the sense that there is always the option at the end of the 7th year for release. You have to consider them indentured servitude, which has an end. Slavery does not have an end. So slavery really, by definition, doesn't exist because there's always an out.
But wait a minute.
You're right. Because slavery, in a way, is also, at least in this country, was multi-generation.
Even if it's an indentured servant, you could say that the person owes a debt to he was indentured because he had a debt, and if you allow him to stay with you, he's not paying that debt.
Well, he is by his service, and it has an and or fixed amount.
But no, he
Can be
left the other
attained.
person and he asked you for refuge.
Well, that concept's a little different, I think, when you think it in terms of refuge for someone running away, which is prohibited.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah. As I said at the beginning when you asked the question, Sukasa, in all honesty and humility, it's something I've never thought about before, but something that I'm going to do a little more digging into. And I assure you I'll come back to you if I find anything interesting. And I do, Jeff, agree that, it's definitely not, traditional, as awful as this sounds, slavery, because of the out clause, as it were, of the 7th year and the mandate to let slaves go free. This is one that I also think is particularly interesting, that you can eat your neighbor's grapes. If you're walking by your neighbor's yard and he's got grapes, you can eat them, pick them and eat them, but you can't take them with you, right? So you can't go and pick all his grapes, fill a basket and take it home with you. But if you're walking by and you want to eat a couple of grapes, totally fine, right? Kind of fits actually in some ways with, I forget the name of the law, but it's at least in LA, civil law, right? That if your neighbor's fruit tree hangs under your property, that fruit is fair game. Or if it hangs on the sidewalk into the public domain, it's fair game. You can't go into their backyard and pick the plums off the tree. But if it's, on the street, it's fair game. When collecting a debt, we're instructed to do it in a righteous way. And, and related to that, one that I've always thought was kind of interesting, but is that when someone's working for you, particularly like a day laborer, but when someone's working for you, particularly if they're poor, pay them a fair wage and pay them that day before the sun goes down. And I thought that was interesting. Not speaking about Will's Rule of our temple, in college and other things, doing kind of odd jobs and song leading sometimes for weekends and odd things at synagogues. It was notorious that I do a weekend and it was 3 months later they finally pay me for it. And I used to think that's so funny when, we of all people, here's a commandment for this. I see a hand up.
Panina. My name
Hey.
is Panina. I'm Talia's mom. I'm here
Nice
from
to meet you.
Cleveland. And nice to meet you all.
Cleveland. Cantor Gurney would be very happy if you Cleveland.
Going back to the slave issue, they are given the choice. And if they choose to stay, we know that they become members of the family. We know from Eliezer, who went to fetch a wife for Isaac. And Abraham sent him, trusting him to do the work. And Eliezer is the one who negotiated the whole deal, and Rebecca became Isaac's wife. We also know about Hagar, Sarah's maid, that when Sarah couldn't bear children, Abraham took her as another second person to give birth to his children. I don't know what you call it, a wife or
concubine, I suppose.
Yes, okay, yes, but she does became a member of the family. And we know of other cases like that also. And that's it.
No, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. And then last but not least, the concept of Levirite, some of us know Levirite marriage, right? The idea that if a father, a husband dies and has a brother, that it's the brother's obligation to marry what would be his former sister-in-law, and to care for her, care for his what would have been his nieces and nephews. Again, kind of, I think this is part of this idea of familial responsibility. Yes, Sukasa.
Does the Orthodox community still subscribe to that, or do they do it in a not a literal sense?
That's a really good question. Not to my knowledge, but I think it creates the challenge of polygamy.
Legality.
It's the challenge, at least in our world, right? Polygamy is rampant in the Torah. It's rampant in the Torah. But the idea that even in an Orthodox community, that the husband would, in essence, have to divorce his wife. So I don't think so, but it certainly, and I think this happens in non-Jewish communities too. When someone dies, there's often, if the family can, there's often a familial sort of, circling of the wagons to care for, even if it's the husband who's left, the wife who's left, obviously kids. So I think, look, my wife's uncle died, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago, something like that now, with two kids who were like grade school, elementary school age kids at the time. He had two brothers, my wife's father and her other uncle. And, to this day, they all, look out for, they've all become very close. They look out for her, they look out for the kids, so I think that's, I think it happens. I think it doesn't happen through marriage, but I think so. If we look at the spirit of this, I think it's basically saying that, look, you take care of your family when somebody dies. You don't just let them fend for themselves. So preparing for this afternoon, pouring through notes and commentaries on the parasha, I came across one that made me think that this Torah portion is actually perfect for Elul, which I never thought about before. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see the text, and we're going to go through some of these. Did that work? Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So, just a second. Let me do this right.
Bo, I hate to keep coming back to this, but the first
Please.
one says, if the ox goes astray, you have to return it. But if the indentured
that's why I said to you we were going to get to this whole idea. Returning lost property.
You're not supposed to. It just kind of seems.
That's exactly why I said it, right? We're going to get to this idea of returning lost property, which might, be a little bit strange for us. Okay, so this is this one that we didn't refer to, and this is not a great translation, but the idea is, right, if you see your neighbor's ox or sheep or horse or donkey or whatever, don't ignore it. You have to take it back to him. You have to return it to him, right? This idea you have to return a lost property. But to my point, Sukasa, notice it doesn't say his slave, because it's not, I would say it's not putting slave in the same category as this property. So, as so often happens, commentators go in a totally different direction than, frankly, I had ever thought about when it comes to this one little prescription, and again, that I think has a lot to teach us about, or teach us in this month of Elul. So Rashi tells us, and that he's using a slightly different, this is the English, but he says, right, this idea that thou shalt not see any of thy brother's herds, right? That if you don't, that you can't ignore it is what he's using for this phrase. That you can't ignore it if it goes astray. Is the same thing as if you were to close your eyes as though you don't see it, right? To blind yourself to something, which I'm going to use as a segue. So 19th century, Reb Nachman of Breslov, in one of his seminal works, says, this is a little long, but I'll read this one and then I'll probably try to coerce some others into reading. But he says, know that one must travel to the tzaddik to seek that which one has lost. For before a person comes into the world, they are taught and shown everything that they need to create and labor and achieve in this world. And once they are out in this world, it is all forgotten from them, as our rabbis teach in the Talmud. And this forgetting is the lost object. Just as our rabbis called the person who forgets someone who has lost, as they say, quick to hear, quick to lose. One must return and seek his or her lost object. And the lost object is with the tzaddik, the righteous person. Because the tzaddik, the righteous person, searches for his or her own lost objects until he or she finds that it or them. And after that, goes and searches for the lost objects of others until he or she finds their losses, until he or she finds the lost objects of the entire world. And therefore, one must come to this wise person, to this tzaddik, to seek and recognize one's own lost objects and receive them again from the tzaddik. But the tzaddik does not return the lost object to its owner until he examines whether or not they are a liar or a deceiver. As it is written in the Talmud about the verse, until they come looking for it, then give it back. Until you examine your brother to know that he is not cheating, right? So this is this idea that, okay, maybe the lost object could be us, something within us, right? Not necessarily property, right? But something that we are searching for, something that is within us. And in a similar vein, to take it one step further here, which ironically comes from a commentary 2 centuries before, one is forbidden to ignore lost objects, but has to pick them up and make every effort to locate the owner for a very simple reason. If the Torah already displays this kind of concern about the restoring of property, how much more concern does it have about saving the soul of a person from becoming lost? In this respect, every one of us is a guarantor. God reserves the option to exact payment from any one of us, just as the lender has the option to be repaid by the guarantor of a loan or by the debtor himself. It is our obligation to do everything in our power to see that a Jew who has strayed from the path of Torah should do tshuva. There's a word that comes up a lot in the month of Elul and the high holy days, right? The idea of tshuva, we literally usually refer to as repentance, but is really about kind of righting our path, right? Turning and getting ourselves back on the right path. And we can't ignore this obligation. Commandment is considered so important that public announcements about lost property, lost objects, can be made on Shabbat. That's how important this whole idea is. And there's an additional aspect to the negative part of the commandment, which is that the failure to return found objects to their owners impedes the arrival of redemption, the arrival of Messiah. And yeah, then it attributes the comments, right? So again, the idea that this is really about finding, well, say it differently, this is really about something that is within us. Right? What pieces of ourselves have we lost? And how do we find them for ourselves? And how do we help others and those we care about, find those pieces of themselves, those potentials within them that, that they have lost? Any thoughts on that? Any reactions to that?
I have a question.
Yes, Merle.
If it's about finding ourselves or helping someone find themselves, if soul or if they'd straight, what about illness where somebody has dementia or Alzheimer's? How do we help them survive, but how do we, you know where I'm going with this? How do we help them find their soul, which is lost?
Yeah. Boy, you guys are just full of easy questions today.
Sorry.
No, I think it's a great question. Well, for starters, I think, look, I don't think our ancestors, I think Alzheimer's probably and dementia was probably a reality for them, but I don't think, to the extent that it is for us, or that they were in tune with it for no other reason, because life expectancy was probably such that they didn't encounter it very often. I think the question, so I don't know that it's present in the text. I think the question for us is, how do we take these values that are clearly being put forth by our tradition, and how do we, incorporate them into the reality of our own lives and our own families, and the pain and the suffering that comes with a loved one suffering dementia. Look, I don't know, and I've never, thankfully, experienced it in my own family, and no one who themselves has experienced dementia or Alzheimer's can tell us.
Right.
I wonder if they feel lost. They are clearly lost to us.
Right.
They are clearly lost to us. But that's, what frequently says of Alzheimer's is that in a way, the victim is the rest of us, not so much the one who is afflicted with it. And I think that, to your point, I think it's I think we can still be there, right? It's not abandoning them. We can still be there, right? And we can remind them of who they are. We are testament to who they were, whether they realize it or not. And I think that is an attempt to find or help find that which is lost, right? Whether it's trying to jog a memory or a reminder or simply being there. I haven't experienced it myself, but I've seen it. I don't know if there's anything more painful than being with someone who doesn't know who you are anymore. But showing up anyway.
And you don't know what they know or what they feel.
Yeah, right.
Well, there's also the fact that babies are not, they don't necessarily know who's mom or who's dad right away. I mean, they have to be kind of taught that, but their soul is still, fine and dandy. So I think it's a progression to that.
Absolutely. Merle, I think about when you say we don't know if they know or not. I'm thinking about, the very, I think it was the very end of Rabbi Leder's Kol Nidre sermon. I believe it was Kol Nidre sermon last year, talking about his father's death and saying, there was this moment when his father, who had not been lucid in, I believe years, and Steve, gave him a kiss and said, "I love you." And his dad had this sharp moment of clear lucidity and, said, "I love you too."
And that's what happened to your mother too. But that was one moment out of 5 years. Yeah,
exactly. But
just curious.
So it's a very, like I said, boy, just easy, lots of easy questions today.
I have on that same kind of path of this whole idea of asking for forgiveness for our transgressions as a group and all of that. What about if God, things are happening like you do everything right and God forbid there's a stillborn baby or there's a two-headed turtle and there's mistakes in nature that happen all the time. So if those, I don't want to say God makes mistakes, but they're definitely, with war and with racism, it's God, puts this stuff in motion and it's up to us to elevate ourselves to be more like that unconditional love and being of ultimate service like God. But maybe, is there ever a time that we're asking, that we're giving forgiveness, that we're forgiving of God's mistakes in a sense, of God's lack of ability to...
That's a very interesting theological question. And I think it depends on one's theology. So I would say, for me...
I'm sorry, it depends on what? I think somebody's volume's on.
I think can we meet it?
I think it's maybe...
Wasn't generated.
So I think that it's a very interesting theological question, right? And to sort of go a roundabout way in answering it. Without getting too deep into a whole, theology class here, but many of you have heard me talk about this before. The traditional idea, Judeo-Christian Western idea of God, is that God is three things, right? God is all powerful, God is all knowing, and God is all good. That's great. But if all three of those things are true, then theoretically, evil should not exist in the world, right? Because God's all powerful, God controls everything, God is all good, and God knows everything that happens in the world. So the traditional answer that I think is given by both Jews and Christians, and probably to some extent Muslims, is that, well, it's our definition of evil that is the problem, right? We think of this as being evil, but that's because our perspective is very narrow, right? And God's perspective is very broad, and that in God's perspective and in God's, perspective of hundreds of millions of years, it's a speck of nothing that maybe serves some larger purpose. Clearly not particularly comforting, to any of us. So the moderns would come along and say, well, then one of those things must not be true in order for evil to exist in the world. So possibility number one, maybe God's not all good, right? Maybe God's got a mean streak and wakes up on the wrong side of the bed one day and decides, you know what, Hurricane Laura, have at the Gulf Coast. Also not particularly comforting. Possibility number two, maybe God's not all knowing, right? Maybe God is, I don't know, busy in the South Pacific. And so a hurricane brews up in the Gulf and, or two of them actually, right? And head toward the Gulf Coast. Or possibility number three, maybe God's not all powerful, right? Maybe God doesn't control every single thing that happens in the world, right? Maybe God's power is actually limited. And that maybe, there are things in the world that are beyond God's control. And that idea is something that you get really fancy, limited theism. The idea that God's power is limited. So to your question about whether or not we would seek forgiveness from God, I think it depends on one's theology, right? One would forgive God. It depends on one's theology, right? If you have a theology in which God is in control of everything and something bad happens, then maybe, you feel that okay, you're going to forgive God for this bad thing that happened. To put my cards on the table, I subscribe to this idea of limited theism. So I don't feel the need to forgive God when something bad happens because I don't think God had anything to do with it. So I think it depends on your theology, right? I got a very interesting conversation. My friend Jason Weiner, who's a rabbi, who's the chaplain at Cedars-Sinai Hospital, amazing modern Orthodox rabbi, brilliant guy. He came and he taught our clergy a few sessions, I don't know, a year or two ago. And we got into this conversation sort of about, in a tangential way, about theology. And, we sort of just got to a place where we agreed to disagree because, I said, how do you sit in a patient's room, in a dying patient's room, and tell their family that's praying that they're going to, survive, that this is God's will? I said, I sit there and tell them, God is not deciding whether your mother lives or dies. That's not within God's control. God can help you feel comforted. God can help you get through this pain. But God's not sitting there deciding, who's going to be born, who's going to die, despite the metaphor that we use on the High Holy Days. And Rabbi Weiner, fully disagrees. He said, look, then if God's not all powerful, then what's the whole point of the enterprise? What's the point of Judaism, right? If God's not all powerful. He said, so for him, I said, well, for me, I see no point in a God that could intervene but doesn't. And his point is, I'm okay with that, basically. I'm okay with a God that could intervene but doesn't, because, it's part of a larger arc and a larger narrative. So, as they say, that's what makes horse races, and is one of the things that is, I think so special about Judaism is that, you can, like the old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. It extends to theology. It extends to God too. If you line up 10, even of the most observant Orthodox Jews you can find, I guarantee you get 12 different ideas about God and theology and all of it. And it's all Jewish. And that's, we don't think about it very often, but is pretty unique. You don't see that in most other religious traditions. So that's a long answer to your do we ever need to forgive God question. I would say depends on the way you think about God. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up with a final thought and a little bit of a story on Elul. And the thought is really that, Elul is about, I think, searching within ourselves and searching for ourselves, for our true selves. Who we, look, we know, right? We know when we're behaving as we ought to be, and we know when we're falling short. And Elul is about really, really looking at that and then making a commitment to the next year and trying to spend more time, on the side that we're more proud of. And the Sfat Emet, a 19th century commentator, thinker, tells this beautiful story where he says there's a headline and it says, "Missing Woman Mystery Solved." A group of tourists spent hours Saturday night looking for a missing woman near Iceland's Elgia Canyon, only to find her among the search party. The group was traveling through Iceland on a tour bus and stopped near a volcanic canyon. Soon there was word of a missing passenger. The woman, who had changed clothes, did not recognize the description of herself. And so she joined the search. But the search was called off at about 3 a.m. when it became clear the missing woman was in fact accounted for and searching for herself. So I wish everybody a happy hunting, I suppose, as we search for ourselves through this month of Elul and into the High Holy Days. Thanks for making a little bit of time to spend the lunch hour with me today. Quick plug, if you were planning to or not, tonight at 6, our Kabbalah Shabbat service. Once a year, based on the bylaws and the government of the state of California, we have an annual meeting every year where we thank our outgoing trustees and we welcome new trustees. And your job as a member of Wilshire Boulevard Temple is to ratify and accept the minutes from last year's meeting. So a little bit of business, but it's our annual meeting as well tonight. So by all means, if you're sitting around at 6 o'clock, please log on and join us. Thank you, everybody. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom.
Everyone.